Joining us now is Bridget Todd. She is a communications director at Ultraviolet, which is a national gender justice organization, and host of the podcast, There Are No Girls on the Internet. Bridget, thank you so much for joining us. How are you today?
I'm great. Thank you for having me.
The pleasure is ours. You're doing a lot of work and coverage of what's happening here in the state of Georgia. Could you just kind of give us an overview of not only what you're seeing, but also what you've been reporting on?
Absolutely. Republican supporters of this law say that it's needed to restore confidence in Georgia's elections. But let's be clear, it's Republicans like Trump who have repeatedly tried to shake the public's confidence in our democracy and our elections by repeatedly claiming that the election was rigged or stolen, even though we know that's not true. And this is what we know about disinformation. The more people hear it, even if it's a lie, the more they believe it. So we know right now that 60% of Republican voters say the election was stolen from Trump, despite this being, not true. So it's incredibly disturbing to me that we're witnessing this new voter law in Georgia as a piece of legislation that is actually birthed from disinformation and distortions and lies. And that should be really scary to all of us, that we have our legislatures making new laws that will actually make it harder for folks to exercise their voting rights in states like Georgia, just based on lies. We should call it what it is. This is a law based on a lie.
Yeah, and in these conversations, because we've been covering it, and as well as so many outlets, the emphasis has always been on the absurdity of the bills. But I appreciate your angle on it, like specifically the disinformation and the misinformation that's going out and the impact that it has had. Have you seen any escalation in terms of the amount of people who are on one side were no longer, they didn't support this idea in the first place? And I guess my question is this disinformation, because it's so ubiquitous, is it having any impact on people who otherwise would have said, of course there's no voter fraud, of course there's no problem, but now it's just so much of it? Have you seen any impact there?
Oh, what a great question. Absolutely. Look at Georgia's Secretary of State, Brad Raffensperger himself. He himself certified that the election results in Georgia were fine. After an audit of the election results, he himself reaffirmed that the state's new secure ballot voting system accurately counted and reported the results. So he himself said, there's no election fraud, no irregularities, it's all fine, yet then goes and makes this legislation that would make you think that there is something going on. Right. And so I think that people, we all know the reason why he certified the election results is because there was no voting irregularity or widespread fraud or election fraud or anything of that nature. And so you have people who on the one side are saying, well, I'll certify these results because they are, completely fine, but yet go along and pass legislation like this. And so, again, I think it's very scary. I think it sets a really scary new precedent. And I think it's being used to we're seeing this kind of legislation all over the place. It's not just about Georgia. According to the Brennan Center, Republicans have introduced 253 anti-voter bills across 43 states. And we are seeing this widespread crackdown on things like abortion access, things like trans youth. It's all related, and it's all amounts to the same thing, which is an attack on our identities and our democracy.
And to what extent do you think this is kind of a consolation prize for Donald Trump versus the agenda all along? Like we've seen, like we hinge, a lot of the reporting hinges this on Donald Trump, but this has been like the agenda of the Republican Party for quite some time. In fact, I was purged from the rolls back in 2004. Could you just speak to how we're communicating on it, where so much has been laid at the feet of Donald Trump, which some should, but how much we're missing in our reporting that this is a consistent and ubiquitous effort by Republicans?
I'm so glad you brought that up. I talk a lot about Donald Trump and the harm that he has caused in our communities, but let's be clear, this did not start with Trump. This has been part of the Republican agenda for a very long time, chipping away at access to voting rights, putting up more barriers for folks to vote, particularly marginalized folks, Black and brown voters, very young voters, first-time voters, college students. This has been part and parcel of their agenda for a very long time. So Trump definitely, I think, gave us a new language that we're seeing sort of permeate all aspects of our media. Unfortunately, we've seen elected officials use this lie of legal votes as if widespread voter fraud is actually a thing that we have to contend to in this country. We know that it's not. So this is absolutely not a new thing. This has been part of the Republican agenda for a really long time. But I think Trump has really weaponized it in ways that are really new and scary.
Yeah. No, absolutely. Coming back to Georgia, there's been a lot of efforts and a lot of efforts by organizations like New Georgia Project, Black Voters Matter, to push back, particularly through boycotts and calling these corporations to bear, bringing them to bear. But I'm curious, in all of your research and all of your reporting on this, what actually can be done now that this legislation has been signed into law? Because a lot of these corporations, there was activism beforehand, and these corporations did nothing beforehand, but now they have a lot to say afterwards. So to me, it's kind of like a dog and pony show, or am I missing something there?
No, you've got it completely right. It definitely does seem a little too late. These corporations want it both ways. I think that, I'll put it this way. We spoke to, on my podcast, There Are No Girls on the Internet, we talked to independent journalist Anoa Changa, who has been studying what's going on in Georgia for a very long time. And something that she said is that, it's always good to see corporations get on the right side of history, the right side of policy. That's always a good thing. But we need to make sure that we are following the lead of groups on the ground in Georgia, like the ones that you just mentioned, New Georgia Project, Black Voters Matter, making sure that we're taking our cues from folks who are actually in Georgia. I think it's great when corporations, for better or for worse, or maybe too little too late, are on the right side of policy and on the right side of history. But we want to make sure that we're echoing what the organizers on the ground in Georgia say they want to happen. So I think that's really, really important, to make sure that we're echoing and amplifying their demands and following their lead, and not from the outside trying to, push a boycott if that's not what they're saying is going to be helpful. But in terms of what we can all do, I think following the lead of these organizations is going to be big. If you've got money, extra money sitting around, donate to some of these organizations. Put your wallet where your values are, and sort of help these organizations that have been doing this important work for so long be as strong as they can, because it's going to be a tough fight coming up,
Yeah, absolutely. And definitely have to give a shout out to my sister, Noah Changa. She's been phenomenal here in Atlanta for years. Speaking of just here in Atlanta, the number of drop boxes and the just the different aspects of the particular legislation seems to be uniquely designed to hurt Fulton County, one of the blackest counties in the entire state, and one of the counties that helped not only John Ossoff and Raphael Warnock, but also Joe Biden. Could you speak to just some of the complexities and the ways this particular legislation is designed specifically to hurt communities of color, particularly Black communities?
I'm so glad you brought that up. I mean, people like to dance around it, but you and I can see what's going on. It's no surprise that this legislation is meant to hurt Black and brown voters and put up unneeded barriers to their ability to vote. So in places like Fulton County, that is definitely a big Black Democratic voting block that's fairly reliable, as you said. This legislation will hurt folks there. Legislation like making it harder to have, mobile voting locations, for places in Fulton County that are impacted by things like long lines, where you have to go out to vote and wait for hours and hours and hours just to make your voice heard. This legislation cracks down on things that people are doing to make it easier for folks to vote, and it's clear that it's being targeted in voting blocks and districts that are heavily Black, heavily brown, and heavily Democrat. Initially they wanted to outlaw Sunday voting, what we call souls to the polls, which many Black churches for years have been using to increase access to voting for a very long time. And so fortunately, this particular part of the bill did not pass. But what does that say about who they're trying to target and who they're trying to keep from the polls, that they would even put that in the legislation? So I think it's very clear this legislation will hurt Black and brown voters the most.
And one of the ways Georgia was able to pull this off, along with a couple of other states that are trying to do this, is because they gutted the Voting Rights Act in Shelby versus Holder. And with the time that we have left, could you speak about the path to fixing this, particularly the H.R. 1, trying to get it passed in the Senate, as well as overcoming the filibuster? Talk about the politics of all this.
Yeah, I think I'm glad that organizations like the New Georgia Project and Black Voters Matter have already sort of said that they're going to hash this out in the court. So I'm looking forward to seeing how that works. But I also think we do need stronger voting rights and access to voting rights and legislation like H.R. 1 that will make that easier. in a democracy, you want to make it easier for folks to vote, not harder. And so I am a big proponent of all of the legislative paths that we have to make sure that making it easier for folks to cast their ballots is codified in our legislation. That's what good democracies do. That's what strong democracies do. So I definitely think, the legal challenges that groups are already mounting, plus the legislative strategy of codifying some more voting bills in our legislation is going to be really important.
And last but not least, I know you saw, along with the rest of the country, saw what happened with Representative Park Cannon as she was simply trying to witness it. Could you just speak about just that incident, but also just the imagery of Brian Kemp along with his comrades signing that legislation into law while a Black representative was being carried away?
Yes. So let's also point, I'm glad that you brought this up. Let's also point out that Brian Kemp and a group of white male legislators signed that legislation under a portrait of a slave plantation, right? That imagery is not lost on me. At the same time, you have a Black lawmaker being dragged out by police in handcuffs for simply trying to witness this. I think that visual really tells you all you need to know about what's going on in Georgia. It's so clear this is an attack on Georgia's Black and brown communities, a way to try to make it so that they cannot have their full access to their, constitutionally protected right to voting. And we need to call it what it is. I think that it's been hard and disappointing and a bit disturbing to see so many outlets dancing around the fact that this is racist, and it's based on a racist lie that Trump and the Republicans had the election stolen from them. And I think things like what you see with the lawmaker being arrested just for trying to witness what was happening, I think really underscore that. It's very clear to me what's going on.
Absolutely. Bridget Todd, communications director at Ultraviolet and host of the podcast, There Are No Girls on the Internet. Thanks so much for joining us today.
Thanks for having me.
Thanks for watching The Young Turks. Really appreciate it. Another way to show support is through YouTube memberships. You'll get to interact with us more. There's live chat emojis, badges. You've got emojis of me, Anna, John, JR. So those are super fun. But you also get playback of our exclusive member-only shows and specials right after they air. So all of that, all you gotta do is click that join button right underneath the video. Thank you.